Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I thought I would chat with you guys a little bit about restoration work and mini workouts that are done, because this is something that is considered to be critical to the West Sider conjugate system. And it's a point a lot of people miss. They look at a system like this, and keeping in mind this could be applied to any training. This can be applied to any training system that you run, but specifically we are talking about this training system because people will look at it and they'll be like, well, I don't know, I don't think there's enough training volume there, because they're not realizing that all the supplemental work is there, and they're not realizing that most of the best experts in the world, even for hypertrophy purposes, are telling you that 10 to 20 quality sets, limit sets a week per a muscle group is going to elicit maximum muscle growth. And keeping in mind the exceeding 20, any of the data that suggests that exceeding 20 causes more muscle growth, and there are plenty that show less, by the way, it's not significant amounts of muscle growth. It's considered to be mildly statistically significant, but it's not like you're talking about an extra pound of muscle per year or something crazy like that. If you were to extrapolate that data, you are talking in the range of a few grams of muscle a year. Potentially, like maybe half an ounce. So keeping in mind that the volume isn't that low, all things considered. But when we start talking about supplemental work and supplemental volume, a lot of this is handled by these smaller workouts. And these smaller workouts do a lot for you. They're there to sometimes build connective tissue, to facilitate extra recovery, give extra training volume to weaker muscle groups. Right, weaker, smaller muscle groups that need more. And a perfect example could be our shoulders and things, right? Delts are very, very volume resistant. They can handle very high frequencies and very high volumes of training, particularly things like rear delts, side delts, things that tend to get neglected through big movements if we're not very careful. So that's a perfect example of a muscle that you could come in and do mini workouts for. Okay. And it's not even the conjugate guys who do that, by the way. Plenty of other guys out there have advocated stuff like that. Eric Bugenhagen, perfect example, advocates stuff like that. And you know, he himself seems to be a pretty good coach, strong guy, good following. He advocates the same thing, doing a bunch of band work for shoulders and stuff. All right, that's a perfect example. Coming in and doing band pull aparts or face pulls or very, very high rep work. But people need to understand, many workouts, you're not coming in and doing heavy sets of 10. Okay? We're not doing that. We're talking about just getting in better shape and staying active and getting active recovery for things. And keeping in mind that a lot of these smaller muscle groups that we have that need extra work sometimes have connective tissue weaknesses, and really, really high reps can help build connective tissue. Okay, and one of the things that Westside's infamous for, and something that I do personally, and yes, when I say that they're well known for this, they are very, very, very well known for this. Like, if you know anything, if you've spent 10 minutes researching this training system or the coaches who advocate it, you know that they all advocate this. And that's doing very high rep reverse hyper work outside of your normal workouts. Right? Generally, you're advised to have one in your gym or to have one at home if you run this. It's a good idea. Well, that falls back into the restoration work also, and connective tissue, because what do we mean by high rep? We're talking at least 30 reps. For me personally, that means 3 days a week. My non-4 training days, I do approximately 5 sets of 30 with 25% of my squat max, which basically means I put 135 on it. Okay? I put 135 pounds on it with 3 plates. And I crank out 5 sets of 30. Very high reps. Same thing, 25, 30 rep sets of band pull aparts. These are normal. Extra ab work. So what we're talking about here is coming in and doing very, very high rep movements on certain muscle groups that you need the extra connective tissue strength or the extra training volume for. That we need the extra recovery for. So people would say, well, why? What's the point? Do you gain muscle from really high reps? Sure, The data shows that we gain muscle from very high reps. Now, what some of the experts argue about, and keeping in mind, this ultra high rep muscle growth stuff is not universally accepted in the sports science world. When you come online, keeping in mind this is what people see over and over and over in certain communities, because there is a specific circle of researchers and coaches who do research on this. They believe in it strongly. They advocate it. But keeping in mind, because they have their own circle jerks, the people who are against it, who think that there are problems with it, do not get a voice, by the way. They don't get the same voice in those circles, and people don't realize that there are people who don't think the data shows it. And that's, if it does, that a lot of the muscle growth may not be actual hypertrophy in the long term. It's largely potentially just transient storage factors and inflammation. So let's come over to the point, though. Let's assume the latter is true. Are there any benefits to coming in and doing a bunch of really high rep work for certain lagging muscle groups? If the latter is true from a strength perspective, if they're primary movers, probably not. Be very, very minimal. But if they're support musculature, does that size matter? In other words, if you have a muscle that's intended to just be a dynamic stabilizer or create support or a shelf somewhere for your strength, do you particularly care about the quality of the tissue in the muscle? Or do you just want it to be bigger? See where we're going with this? Same thing if you just want the muscle to look bigger. Does it need to be actual tissue hypertrophy? Not necessarily. I mean, if that was the case, bodybuilders wouldn't be all full of oil. And every professional bodybuilder uses enormous amounts of site enhancement oil. Just throwing that out there. All of them. It's not something you need to, oh, how can I spot it? They all do. Their proportions require it. Let's get that out of the way. Plenty of natty pros do the same thing. So if a person just wants a muscle bigger, well, potentially this works. What about the work capacity and recovery side and connective tissue? Yeah, that's a big deal. That's a big deal. There is data out there, and we know from watching various athletes, that if you have tendons that are prone to tearing and you do some high rep work specific with very small exercises for those tendons, they tend to be more injury resistant. So there's definitely potential for connective tissue recovery from it, connective tissue hypertrophy. Then we deal with the overall just recovery side. Again, if we have a muscle that is lacking or lagging, and it's a smaller muscle like that, it could be your triceps, it could be your rear delts, it could be your hamstrings, it could be your erectors. And we do very, very high volumes of high rep work for it. What does that do in the long term? It increases work capacity, increases muscular endurance, it increases the ability to clear waste products. Okay, oftentimes our deficiency in a muscle can very well be a recovery deficiency, meaning it's getting hit relatively hard with good tension and training, but it just doesn't respond as well because it doesn't recover as easily. There could be a blood flow issue, a lack of work capacity, and that can be corrected by doing these little mini workouts. Okay, that it can be corrected with that. And no, please don't use goofy YouTube terms that other semi-famous YouTubers use who aren't strength athletes. We don't need all that thrown in. I hate it when people do that. Those people were not important in the strength or conditioning world. Okay, please keep their nonsense out. So you guys already know what term people will use for that. All right, the guy was a buffoon. The guy was a buffoon and a drug addict. We don't need to normalize his terminology. So the point here being, yeah, there is something to it from a recovery and a work capacity side also, and it just keeps you more physically active. Look, if you're coming in and doing smaller mini work throughout the week, it's going to help keep you in better shape. Is it a big part of your general physical preparedness? Not necessarily, because we're going to generally be doing general physical preparedness work also. People say, what do you mean? Well, metabolic conditioning, right? I personally choose to drag a sled these days. That's what I do for conditioning. Other people do loaded carries. You could do kettlebell swings. You could do barbell complexes. You can do all sorts of stuff for conditioning. We're going to do tire flips. Okay. I drag a sled. That's what I choose to do. Doesn't mean I won't do other stuff. I have farmer's walk handles. That's what I do. But that's separate in and of itself for getting into shape. But again, the mini workouts do help. They do help, and they do add up, and they do accumulate various benefits. And they're an important part of this training system. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.